Hey, I'm Blake Gray, and I am here talking with Chad Melville. He's the head wine grower for Melville Vineyards, which you'll note the connection in the name, started by his father in Santa Barbara County. Um, Chad's an interesting guy. He's been a winemaker. He's had his own winery. He has been a chef on a safari in Africa, which I find fascinating. And he is now trying to keep the vineyards going during a pandemic, which is not the easiest thing to do. So let's talk about that. So Chad, what are you doing right now? So first tell me, what is it the vineyards need right now that you can't really put off?
Well, the vineyard is cranking. I mean, it's active. We just got through dormancy, so we have bud break. We just received a last little bit of rain. Hopefully it's not the last little bit, but we're at about almost 11 inches for the year, which is fantastic. We could use more. And then we're mowing the cover crop right now, just laying it on top of the surface, allowing it to continue to grow a little bit, but we're not tilling it in. We're basically encouraging more organic matter into the soil, which is food for all the microbiology, which is fantastic, especially given the soils that we have here, which are ancient marine, well-drained, low nutrient. The impact of the cover crop is huge. What we're doing in the vineyard right now, as far as labor goes, I've got a crew of 22 that I keep employed year round. I've got 120 acres planted here in Santa Rita Hills. So the crew is busy right now working with shoot thinning, which is a practice of basically balancing out the vine, and also kind of a side project right now. We're doing a little replanting, mostly own rooted stuff, but we do have a little bit of rootstock as well. So we're pretty busy out there. It's challenging, as you noted, with this pandemic. The vineyard has really, well, the coronavirus has zero effect on the vineyard. So the challenge is keeping everybody spread out. The challenge is keeping everything, sanitized and organized, and then moving forward. If I don't keep pace with the vineyard, and where we mid-March, when it comes time to harvest, or basically every other stage of this year's growth, I can't afford to be behind. And so I got to keep moving forward.
Now, we talked about this by email that, the governor announces that businesses are shut down, but you can't let this stuff go, right? I mean, so what can you do to keep your crew from basically socially distant from each other?
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, because you naturally want to be around, your friends, your family, and the benefit is being outside. The crew is spread out. We have 8-foot wide rows, and everybody takes a row. So there you go. We're more than 6 feet apart, but really the challenge becomes, at break and lunchtime, where people want to gather together, eat together, hang out, even cook together. So we just keep re-educating and making sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing, being responsible. The vineyard is, like I said before, it's 100% active right now. Even the winery. I mean, behind me, we've got 6 barrels of Chardonnay that we just racked this morning. So we got cellar work. We got about.
What do you do when you rack?
Oh, sorry. So we basically we take this tool right here with a little sight glass there. This bottom part goes through the bunghole, sits at the bottom of the barrel right here with a little spacer where the lees is. So the spacer allows the wine to go through here above the lees. And we're essentially basically taking off the clean wine from the lees, go to tank with all that wine, flip the barrels over, allow the lees to drain out, clean it out, put the barrel back upright, take the wine from tank and go back to barrel. So essentially you're removing the clean wine away from the lees. And the reason why we do it is because occasionally, not very often, the lees can get a little stinky or reductive. And so by simply taking the wine off of the lees and allowing it to receive some oxygen, it cleans it up. It gets rid of the kind of the stinkiness.
What happens if, this is another one of these things, what happens if you don't do that, if you're not in the winery to do that?
Well, then the aroma or state of the wine will keep getting more intense with that reductiveness, which is hydrogen sulfide, which is a kind of a rotten egg aroma. And so if you don't address it, you eventually will need to address it down the line. And so it's best to address it kind of at the earlier stages, I believe. This wine does not go through malolactic. This wine does not receive any new wood at all. So it's very vulnerable in a lot of ways. When you make wine in this kind of naked format, if there's one blemish, it'll stick out of the glass. So I like to address things early. Now, if you don't address it and you let it keep going, then you're really only left with very few options, all of which are pretty dramatic. Filtration, adding a copper to kind of break the chains, or just adding other wines on top of it to kind of bury that.
To hide the bad aroma.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a big winery and in a really big industrial winery, they would do the stuff without a second thought. They would filter it. They would use harsh chemicals or whatever. But you're trying to make your wines organically, right?
Absolutely, and that's kind of the benefit, I think, of being a little bit smaller, is that perhaps you can be more on top of things. I don't know. I just not to talk about what other people do. Just what we do here is we're really on top of things. And we're also dedicated. We're 100% a state, right? We own our own land, do all of our own farming, don't purchase fruit from anybody. So for us to kind of really make that point even more clear, like have the purity of the wine present. We don't mess around with a lot of technique. We don't even use any new oak at all, right? So all the barrels I use are 15, 25 years old, which is to say that everything you smell, feel, and taste in the wine is coming directly from the vineyard, not the cellar, right? And so it's really critical then that, my job is to make sure the wines are clean.
And so you've got to have, not only do you have to have your workers in the vineyard to keep up with what the vines need now, but you've got to have workers in the winery. You can't leave this stuff alone.
Can't leave it alone. It's just myself and Jose Luis, which you may see. He's not there right now, but he's floating around. But yeah, I mean, we don't do a lot of winemaking, to be honest. I mean, this just happens to be a day that we're racking. Yesterday there was absolutely nothing to do in the cellar. Tomorrow there's nothing to do in the cellar. So we don't do a lot of cellar work. But yes, when we do cellar work, it's Jose Luis and myself, and that's very critical. I mean, we got to get the stuff done.
Now, you were telling me, so you're talking about you're going to be planting or replanting. You have some vineyards that. Well, first of all, why will you do the replanting?
So we've got 120 acres here. My brother and I planted this vineyard 23 years ago. So we have a couple spots of the vineyard that, for whatever reason, we've had some disease, some Pierce's disease. We've had just vines that didn't take very well. Perhaps it's, not a great combination of clone rootstock to the soil type. So the last couple of years, we rearranging a tiny little bit, maybe like 10% of our vineyard, about 12 acres. So when we replant that, essentially you have, basically two routes to take when you plant a vineyard, period. One is on rootstock, which protects you from certain diseases that exist in the soil. And then the other would be called own rooted, which is simply just taking a dormant cane, and sticking it in the ground, cutting it at a certain angle, burying it with some dirt, and allowing that kind of vine to wake up on its own, and then it will produce its own roots and start growing above ground.
And there's a brief science explanation that why you might not want to do that, which is that in America's gift to the wine world was this root louse called phylloxera that kills grapevines, and it's spread all around the world. It's tiny. It has a ridiculous 17-stage life cycle, but it basically sucks the life out of every vinifera grapevine you've ever heard of: Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Syrah, you name it. They're all vulnerable to phylloxera. So instead of planting them, which Chad is doing very dangerously, planting these vines on their own rootstock, normally you take an American rootstock, which on its own would produce an inferior grape, and you just take the rootstock and you graft that Pinot Noir or that Chardonnay or that Syrah or whatever onto that stronger rootstock. And then most vines in the world are now planted on rootstock, but some people believe that wines will taste better if it's just one plant. It's just on its own roots. It's not a Frankenvine. But it's at a risk, because if phylloxera comes to your vineyard, and phylloxera is in Santa Barbara County, right? I mean, it's
not prevalent, but it is here, yes.
Yeah. So if somebody walks into your vineyard and they had a phylloxera egg on their shoes that they got from some other vineyard, then 3 years from now you've got to replant, right?
Yeah, totally. Or it could be as simple as like borrowing your buddy's tractor, right? And like that brings in the dirt as well. So there's a lot of ways that phylloxera can infiltrate your vineyard, but there's also just other diseases as well. And so the benefit of planting on rootstock is that you have protection from those diseases. There's certain rootstocks that have developed as well that perhaps do better in sandy soil or drought conditions, or certain rootstocks that do well in the opposite, more clay soil, wetter conditions. So rootstock can play a really important role, not just in protecting yourself or the vines, but also kind of embracing the environment that they're put in too.
It's interesting. And what will you do? What kind of moves will you make to try to protect these own-rooted vines in your vineyard?
Well, you calculate the risk as best you can, and in our case, we're fascinated by the own-rooted concept, the theory of it, and I don't think I'd ever totally go to own-rooted, because I want the perimeter of the vineyard to be protected, and so that'll almost always most likely be on rootstock. So what we've done is, where we're own-rooting is essentially kind of in the center of the vineyard and kind of working its way out. But that's one means of kind of added protection, if you will. It certainly doesn't mean that you won't get it. It's just kind of putting the odds in our favor.
Now, folks at home watching this, we tried to do this a few minutes ago. Video cut off. We're going to try it again. Chad is going to go outside and show us this rootstock with his computer. So we're gonna try and show you what this rootstock. And it's interesting because you kept this rootstock over the winter in a cold room.
Yeah.
That's
so
right?
You gotta, you can work with vines in this regard, in terms of like taking a bud out of, cutting a bud out of the wood, essentially, dormant vines. Thank you. Yeah.
Even hi.
So you work with vines that are dormant. You can do a lot of different things. So you put them in cold storage, you keep them dormant, and then when you're ready, you pull them out of cold storage, you let them acclimate a little bit, and then you basically trim the roots to kind of stimulate growth once they go into the ground. And then you put them in the ground, and then boom, they acclimate to their brand new world, and then they start growing. You want to do this part of it kind of early spring, where all the other vines are dormant as well, so everything kind of wakes up at once. So here is an example of the rootstock that we're using here. It's 1103P. We use a bunch of different rootstocks, but we found this one works really well for us here in Santa Rita Hills with our soils. The rootstock was grown at the nursery basically 2 years ago, and just the rootstock. So at this point, it didn't have an identity other than the 1103P, right? So in other words, it wasn't a varietal and it wasn't a clone, the last 2 years. What they did last year was then take a bud off of Pinot Noir, and this is the clone 37, took the bud off of the stick that was clone 37, that's certified disease-free, everything, and then they cut it into the rootstock, and then they basically, in this case, they put hot wax or warm wax on the kind of scab, if you will, so that it's protected, and then essentially that clone 37 starts its growth, right? And then it went into dormancy one more time, and then they basically bundle it up and ship it to us like this. So this is about 25 vines right here. Each vine is almost about $5. So they're not cheap, but only because if you add that up, that's a lot of money plus the labor to put it in, blah, blah, blah. So that's what it looks like, right? This is
The green part, I'm pointing at the screen. There's not anybody can see me pointing, but the green part of the bud, that's Pinot Noir, and basically everything else is just rootstock. It's just the green part,
yeah,
right? Pinot Noir.
exactly. Yeah. So the root, yeah, basically, if you think about it, like the cutting your head off and putting on another body, the body being the root stock, and then the head being, the personality or the identity of.
I've often thought about cutting my head off and putting it on LeBron James's body. I think that would work really well.
I don't know, Blake. I think you got to have that, that mentality that comes with LeBron too, right?
Might come from inside. Who knows? So how long will it take? You're going to plant those. I assume you have them out ready to plant today or this week. How long will it take before you start getting some Pinot Noir grapes from those?
Well, Pinot's a little bit different. Pinot takes a little bit more time. Now, if the conditions are perfect, everything takes off. What'll happen is this year it'll grow, a couple different canes. We'll pick the strongest one, at the end of the season. In other words, we'll take off the canes that aren't as strong. And we'll let it grow as much as it can, really kind of developing more of the root system. And then next winter, this coming winter, we'll cut that back all the way again to basically 2 buds. So in other words, asking the vine just to produce 2 canes. And then sometime around summer of next year, so 2021, we'll eliminate that other cane and then allow that one to kind of make it up on its wire, right? The cordon wire, so now growing horizontally. And in which case, it may want to produce fruit at that point, but you don't want that fruit because you just want the vine to focus on growth. If it has fruit, it's gonna eventually switch its focus to ripening up the fruit. So the fruit would be minimal, the fruit wouldn't be very good. And again, we want it to establish a stronger root system and then in this case, again, a cordon cane that's strong. So it'll take about 2, maybe 3 years for it to actually get some fruit beyond counting the 2 years of how old it is right now.
Wow, so from the time that you decide you're going to do this, it's 4 years total before you get any Pinot Noir that you can use. Is it any different with own roots? Is the schedule any faster with an own rooted vine?
No, it's pretty much the same. I mean, again, it depends on how well it takes, but in an ideal situation, there shouldn't be a lot of difference. I mean, this is a 2-year-old vine. The other way to do it is receive green growers from a nursery, which are plants that did not go through a winter time. And so they're a 1 year younger, right? So you got own rooted, you got green growers or 1-year-old vine, and then you got dormant vines, which are 2 years old. So 2-year-old vine is going to be a little bit more expensive. Maybe they're not all available, whatever. But those are the 3 options. All of them take about 4 to 5 years of being in the ground to produce fruit.
So this gets full circle back to what we started talking about. You've already got an investment of a year in these, young vines as it is. And if you don't get those in the ground, 3 years from now, you have a problem. So you're talking about a 4-year cycle that, the pandemic it could interrupt if you're not allowed to get people out to the vineyard to work.
Absolutely. Yeah. You got to keep the engine churning, if you slow down or stop or, delay, whatever, it affects, my business greatly because our whole business is literally and figuratively, based on the vineyard, right? We're being a state, we don't buy fruit from anybody. We own our land. We do all of our own farming. So the land, the farming side of this is the most important part. We can't do anything without having the land. And in our case, we're really shooting for premium, clean, pristine, high quality fruit. So once you get that, right, then the rest of this kind of project, it makes a lot of sense, in terms of no manipulation, really focusing on the nuances, the beauty that Mother Nature's provided outside. To get into a bottle with a presentable, clean, beautiful, attractive wine that, people want to purchase. That's how this whole thing is connected. Yeah. So we can't slow down in the vineyard.
Cool. All right, Chad. Well, thanks for talking with me today. I know it's a busy season for you and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
And, good luck. Stay healthy.
Appreciate it. You too, Blake.
All right. Thanks, Chad. Bye-bye.